Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity to come here and learn a whole bunch of stuff that I knew nothing about. It's rare that I'm able to do that with these kind of things. Also, big questions really terrify me, like what is the urban? I mean, I don't even do so well on small questions, like when my kids ask me, what are we having for dinner tonight? So I'm going to obviously go overboard and sort of slash and burn my way through this big question that has been posed. So what has happened to the Black City? From Mumbai to Chicago to Salvador to Jakarta, various vernaculars have mistakenly designated the Black City as something impenetrable but replete with an almost erotic captivation, as something full of squalor but unaccountably generative, the inhabited uninhabitable. Yet the Black City always played on this. Not really a place after all, but a constant improvisation, systematic, operational, and charming. Always keeping in mind that improvisation is not just like chaos all over the place. It's systematic, it's charming. So what is the Black City? Well, Black City, at least for me, is three things. One, it's the place of residency for racially black inhabitants, or the place for the rendering equivalent, the inhabitation of non-black others to those of blacks themselves. Secondly, the place of fundamental darkness, where the inability of those surveying the city to make clear distinctions as to the constitutive identities and practices of inhabitants rendered them black. That is, made them in need of subjugation or consigned them to a kind of nothingness. And thirdly, the Black City as a place of presumption. It was presumed what took place there, and thus obviated any need to look further, obviated any need to look at the details of everyday life. As such, residents of the Black City might seize the interstices between the exertion of control through limiting the spatial extensionality of the Black City and disattention to its details to experiment with various ways of living. Classic examples of these are the radically disjunctive experiments with reconfiguring relations amongst bodies, economy, and residential units that took place in the racially black cities of Chicago and Detroit. The Black Metropolis is the classic example of a period of intensive experimentation of the way in which you make urban economies out of particular relationalities amongst different kinds of bodies, different kinds of histories. So the dismantling of the last vestiges of collective life, the apparent, even fictional solidarities connoted by blackness are desocialized. So that which is seen as epitomizing the possibilities of resistance to the predominant logics of accumulation and positing different ways of inhabiting the urban are increasingly to be taken apart. And this stems from the perception that blackness is some kind of univocal force, that it is a solidarity beyond all reason, that then acts as a constant reminder of the insufficiency of whiteness, the insufficiency of capital. That is, that which was constituted as blackness, ends up being feared as that which points to the lack in the very logic that constituted it as a lack. So in other words, blackness as a lack is then feared because it reveals the lackness in the very thing that made it a lackness. And it's that logic which I think rests at the heart of a kind of fear of blackness that pervades the planet. The demise of the Black City also points to the end, or perhaps remaking, of the disciplinary project. Rather, bodies are managed simply through incarceration and eviction. They are parceled into intensely particularized residential contexts. The fragmentation of the subject into probabilities and affected inclinations. It's a population set loose, disentangled and forced into constant motion. As such, Blackness connotes the pervasiveness of a threat that is always there, but which assumes no definitive form. The threatened, we that are the threatened, are always in the dark, always must live with a darkness that is contained only through displaying constant self-vigilance as the eligibility for our protection. That is, in some sense, the threat. Blackness also connotes the threat of something that's really not even identifiable. We don't know where it's coming from next. There's nothing that we can do to protect ourselves except to always be vigilant, always be on the lookout, always well behaved, always, and that's the only eligibility that we have for our own protection. So in some ways, citizenship don't mean much of nothing, nowhere anymore. On what grounds does Black life matter? Well, in some ways, Black life matters, or the Black City matters, because it is at the intersection of two particular kinds of questions. That is, on the one hand, the sheer attempt to stay alive, the disqualification from arbitrary death, as the obligation of the democratic political contract. Is that a particular question about why Black life matters? Or what is the situation that matters too much, that has too much work to do, that has to absorb too many contradictory desires, and yet that matters too little? That is, either not working out or working out this conundrum is one of the driving forces of the urban. It's about all the public secrets, all the illicit economies, the dangerous circulations of bodies and vectors of contamination, all the informal mechanisms of decision-making, all the incessant threats and deployment of violence necessary to run cities. All of these are exemplified by Blackness. It ushers in what Dieren Verleden calls the racism of interception, targeting ways of life and bodies before they get out of hand, to efface rather than to make use of whatever is at hand, as was the logic of the Black City. The logic of the Black City, in many ways the logic of the auto-constructed city, was a city that was made by basically the gathering up of whatever was there to be made. And so in some sense, the racism of intersection is to efface rather than to make use of whatever is at hand. And then another way in which the Black City matters is that it has been subject to what might be called grand theft auto. That is, the theft of auto construction. I mean, auto construction was never just about residents making buildings. Auto construction was never about just making places to live or making ways to service them. Auto construction was about making ways of life. So even if the state outrolled basic sites and services, even if the state provided public housing, even if auto construction was basically a particular way of making urban life. Elaborating economies of provision to thick relationships of collaboration and care. That is, the possibilities of combining. That is, making relational operational systems. So density meant not just packing in a lot of things into a limited space. Rather, density was the creation of a particular kind of space, where people with their devices and resources and tools and imaginations and techniques were always acting on each other, pushing and pulling, folding in and leaving out making use of whatever others are doing, paying attention to all that is going on, fighting and collaborating. And I would argue too, if I had a lot more time, that what we consider to be the basic devices of financialization, speculation, collateral debt obligations, securitization, are in some ways feeding off of some of the very logics through which popular and majority communities made the economies of their own communities. Now, it wasn't financialization in the particular way that we understand it, but some of the logics that then get appropriated by financialization, one can see incipient forms in the way in which these areas constructed their own particular kinds of economic life. So when you consider that also the urban is increasingly the biggest auto-constructed project in town. I mean, we used to think about the urban as the locus where things got made, but increasingly, the urban simply makes itself. It is simply a kind of auto-constructed project. So cities and regions become increasingly the occasion and vehicle to give rise to the unanticipated, an excess of sociality, a purported abundance of opportunities for collaboration, the endless remaking of inhabitants, the conversion of spaces into nodes of new synergies. So value and profit are generated not so much from making things, but putting things into all kinds of connections, constantly changing what any particular thing might mean and might count for and be used at a particular time. But this is the very same kind of logics through which black cities basically constructed themselves. So that's why I say in some ways it's a kind of grand theft auto. Because in some ways the hegemony of urban capital begins to rely on things of which there's a long history in the way in which popular districts, black districts, basically created themselves. So intensifying and extending this process becomes the intent of urbanization. And then what happens to the black city is this massive attempt to basically efface its own capacity to do the very same thing which urban capital does in order to ensure its own survival. So increasingly the black city is now made almost completely invisible in expulsion to far peripheries, through dilution, or simply extinguished. So if its empirical body, if its thingness or demographics disappear, it may be necessary to return to the very mechanics of the inscription that designated this city as black, and perhaps find something in the sheer technicity of these mechanics of inscription to think how blackness lives on. That is, how blackness lives on and is operationalized in the inoperable. And I'll get to that in a moment. Inscription. So when you inscribe something, if you make the inscription that this is black and this is not black, or if you make the inscription that this is black or this is white, inscription in its most basic technical maneuver remains the marking of something through its corresponding nothingness. The civilized against the uncivilized, and so forth. Inscription is the tool of cutting. So once something is defined against what it is not, that what it is not is then cut loose from that from which it has been differentiated, no matter how tied it may be to a conceptual, economic, or political dependency. So no matter how much we know that white supremacy is dependent upon the inscription of something as blackness, once you've inscribed it that way, blackness is in some sense cut loose from whatever it is that you can use to, you can't go back to white supremacy and then define exactly then what blackness is. That is, it assumes the position of being anything whatsoever. That is, that which is cut in order to keep alive something which is, then to a certain extent exist as anything whatsoever. Despite the proliferations of narratives, interpolations, and spatial controls through which it is subject. It don't mean that blackness is free, but it just means that blackness is uncapturable in some important sense. And this is important because blackness is one of the critical inscription tools at a global scale. So if the capacity for self-reflection, for a narration of progress and a reading of the world in terms of a particular order of things depended on the construction of subjection of blackness, then any particular reading of blackness itself is inoperable in and of itself, which is basically then a contradiction of this very presentation. I mean, the very presentation then is contradictory in the very logic I'm using to make it. But you can't have everything. Yet blackness continues to point to the inexplicable and the incalculable, and traditions of care that appear to be critical practices in face of what Bernard Stiegler calls the generalized formalization of life. So then, black life, otherwise historically condemned to finitude, black life condemned to not exceed anything but itself as an expendable other, or black life as the epitome of a calculated life, as property, welfare cost, correctional probability, in and of itself promises the infinity of the incomputable. That is, when this anything whatsoever then becomes the promise of the incomputable. So the Black City's promise is of an incomputable city. A city that no matter what you say about it, you just ain't going to get to what all that it possibly is. So it is the promise of the incomputable. So I'm going to look at this promise of the incomputable in terms of the relationship between two notions of the inoperable. So I'm using two notions of the inoperable. That is, on the one hand, the inoperable is the inability for what's there to really work. That is, the incapacity to enact what is promised, something whose efficacy is elsewhere, what is enabled by the promise by virtue of its apparent failure. And then there's a notion of the inoperable as that whose functioning cannot be assessed, that does not promise fruition, that does not promise to be concretized, that which cannot be detected, that which circulates in various guises but remains outside of circulation. So inoperable 1.0, inoperable 2.0. So, I mean, we know that in the inoperable 1.0, that modernity, in most respects itself, is inoperable. The inoperable of millennial cities, sustainable urban enclaves. I mean, modernity, because it requires all kinds of mediation to make them work, all kinds of undeclared and unregistered services, displays of violence, and readjustments. The pretense of efficiency and precise calculation give way to hedges of all kinds. Various forms of brokerage to fudge occupancy rates, to navigate the complexities of multiple bureaucracies. What promises to be seamless, nothing is seamless. It's always full of holes. The imaginaries, the formatting, and realization of millennial projects would break down if left on their own. They would become functionally inoperable. We have the inoperable salary. I mean, across much of the so-called global South, the salary doesn't exist as a kind of operable thing anymore. People don't get kinds of a salary. Remunerations that are paid to employees for many reasons, to save taxes, for promoting certain products and services. So while the salary is paid as a straightforward fund transfer, increasingly people are being paid through other types of remuneration, gift vouchers, special discount cards, insurances, travel arrangements, access, fuel, newspapers, books, hardware, medicine reimbursements, across India, across Indonesia, people just, the salary is not something that one has or counts upon anymore. So the salaried work, like formal labor, formal sector, as that is of wage labor, doesn't really exist anymore because the wage as a kind of entity in itself increasingly doesn't exist anymore. So it triggers a wide range of so-called gifting relations, where the value of reciprocities becomes increasingly difficult to calculate. So that which is apparently the residues of the formal become increasingly looking like the informal. So I want to talk about a kind of, I want to talk about an example of the way in which this notion of the incomputable is enacted in the relationship between these two forms of inoperability. So there remains something about the urban that hits you in the face, an aesthetics of appearance where things can be anything whatsoever. A single force doesn't drive these aesthetics. They do not match up in a point-by-point correspondence to empirical conditions. Rather, they exist as a kind of underlying reverberation, an impulsion to continuously move on that overrides the very registers of value that are negotiated at the intersection of capital and vernacular processes. This is not a world about the assemblage of hybrid urbanizations or mutant forms or cyborg worlding or an imminent singularity. Rather, it is a continuous proliferation of non-subsumable details, incapable of being made interoperable at the intersection of a generalizable planetary scalable urban form and its instantiation within specific fields. That is, if you look at the sort of logics and modalities of urban governance today, it's all about making things interoperable. It's all about taking discrete kinds of data across different kinds of sectors and finding particular kinds of calculations in a language and mechanism to make them interoperable. In some ways, then, the Black City endures as this kind of locus that resists this kind of interoperability, that in some sense it exists aside it in a fundamental way. So if we take, for example, okay, this is the building I'm going to be talking about. This is the market outside that I'm going to be talking about. This is the sort of market, the formal market that I will be speaking about. This is inside the formal market I will be speaking about. So in the Tanah Serial district in Jakarta, residents who largely work in a self-constructed produce market, and who collectively manage the proceeds, have invested a large proportion of them in constructing a building which is the size of a football field. They have been working on this building for nearly a decade, and they refuse to finish it. They are constantly changing it around, not knowing how to decide for sure what it will be used for, how to calculate the apportioning of the space according to either the money or labor that individual residents have invested. After a decade, they remain uncertain as to what it is that it will be. After a decade, they remain uncertain as to what it is that will be eventually completed. But yet they continue to work on it, and that continuously don't know exactly what it will be used for and when it will be finished. There is no clear end in sight. Yet the efforts of the residents have generated many side effects. It isn't that the incompletion, it is not that the inoperability of the building doesn't have a reality. It doesn't mean that their efforts don't spin through a wide range of networks that permeate across the city in a lot of very quiet but profusion of details. Then, not far away stands the official market. This official market is fully staffed by municipal officials, but it's completely empty. Hardly anything goes on inside. It's completely dark, completely useless, nothing there. But yet the municipality continues to pay the salaries of those that officially staff the market. Yet in the parking lot in front, from mid-afternoon to the early morning, stands the nerve center of a market that is expanded throughout the surrounding area, over which the market officials nominally preside, but don't really run. So even though the real economy is elsewhere, it's in the street. It's ramifying across the, because things have to come in from, produce has to come in from the outside. Trucks have to be directed into this very thick part of the city. They have to come by the hundreds and be unloaded at particular times. They're unloaded and they have to be set up, and tables have to be set up, and space has to be divided. And then since this is also operates as partly a wholesale market, then other trucks have to come in and pick up the stuff and take them. So over the course of 8 hours or 10 hours or so, a very intricate social economic machine is in operation. And people have been doing this for a long time. They have a great deal of confidence in what it is that they do. There are all kinds of ways in which, over the years, everyone else can do each other's job. The people who drive the trucks can as easily unload them. The people who farm can as easily drive the trucks. The people who sell the food can as easily, there's a circulation of people throughout these, so you don't ever know really who they really are. The guy who drives the truck, the woman who drives the truck, not necessarily confined to that role. For that moment, you know who they are. But next month, they may be a totally different thing, totally different kind of role. So they circulate through this kind of economy, acquiring the kind of capacity to know every this particular aspect of it. But even though all of this is in place, and even though the real economy is elsewhere, a large amount of attention is still paid to the void of the official market. Everyone still talks about, everyone looks at that empty building. Everyone still, rumors about this empty building. Always say, oh, what is the market doing? What's up with the market? How's the market? Referring to this kind of empty void as if it still is operational in some kind of way, even though it is in some sense inoperable. As if it is a black box replete with secrets and mystical power. So between these sort of notions of the inoperable, a kind of product of people's labor over years to build a building that doesn't yet really function in the way that we think it would function. It doesn't reach completion. There's not an idea of its use. And the inoperable of a market that we think we know what it is, and yet it is empty and a void, and there's nothing there, but still people pay attention to it as if somehow it supersedes the very complex system that people in large way through their efforts have built for themselves. There's something then about the urban and its notion of inoperability, which is the medium through which the black city lives on, despite every effort to sort of take it apart, to eviscerate it, to efface it, to simply get rid of it. And so in some ways, if the city that is made by us always leaves us deficient and vulnerable to dangers from which we must then defend, but at the same time that no matter what, the city is the culmination of everything that we are able to be, then the very act of trying to always ensure our survival, always attempting to protect ourselves, might be that which renders us the most vulnerable. And then I will just leave with the words of an African-American geographer. I'll just leave with these words. Thank you very much.